Good morning everyone. Let me welcome you again to the NPTEL course, The History of English Language and Literature. Today's lecture is titled The Age of Tennyson or the Victorian Era. So just like we had been taking a look at various literary ages from the beginning onwards, we noticed that these eras could be named in different ways. It could be either based on the most representative writer of the period, like we are doing here, the Age of Tennyson. It could also be with the reigning monarch of those times, like the Elizabethan era or the Victorian era in this case. So at the outset, keeping in tune with the mode of our lecture, we begin looking at the literary reflections from the previous age, in which we also find a continuation towards the present Victorian age. The previous age, the Romantic age, was dominated by a revolutionary spirit. We do find that though a certain conservative reaction set in England at the later revolutionary phase, we find that the revolutionary spirit had not completely left the English writing or reading public. So in that sense, from the late 18th century onwards, a certain sense of Victorian spirit had begun to set in, particularly with the Jacobin novels of the 1790s. It was a set of writers known as the British radicals who supported the revolution. So from that time onwards, a certain discontent was getting outlined, and this we eventually found a definite shape in the Victorian era. It is perhaps too early to identify these connections from the late 18th century towards the Victorian era, but however, it is quite interesting to note that from the Romantic period onwards, and in fact from the pre-Romantic period onwards towards the modern period, there is a strain of continuity which can be identified not just in the literary movements but also in the socio-political and historical progression of world history itself. Incidentally, in case we missed stating it in one of the earlier sessions, Jacobin was a revolutionary political movement that was the most famous political club also during the French Revolution. And during this period, due to the anxieties of the revolutionary spirit and also the aftermath of the French Revolution, a sense prevailed within Britain that a reading public had become a revolutionary public. So the revolutionary movement was no longer the priority or the prerogative of a selected few. The entire reading public seemed to celebrate this spirit and also participate in it, though in a quite a passive way. For instance, there were quite a few writers who responded to this new spirit and also found much recognition among the reading public. For example, Shelley's poem based on the Peterloo massacre, titled The Mask of Anarchy. It was banned for about 30 years, but irrespective of that, it did find acceptance eventually when it was more popular and more accepted. Talking about the 19th century, it was characterized by a multiple turn of events which could be more literary than perhaps political and social. In the 1820s, as we have noticed, the decade was dominated by the deaths of Byron, Keats and Shelley, but however, this major lack was in a certain way or the other covered by the major literary success that Walter Scott began to enjoy with his fiction. And the 1820s and the 1830s in that sense was also the era of the historical novel. So towards the end of the Romantic age, we find a transition towards the Victorian period, and especially this is noticeable in the way in which particular genres were getting more dominant than the other. And novel towards the end of the Romantic period, we notice that it became hugely popular than all the other forms of writing, and it would perhaps suffice to state that it was the novelists rather than the poets who became the literary representative of the Victorian age. So at the outset itself, we begin with this understanding that just like the Romantic period was severely dominated by the Romantic poets, the Victorian period was dominated by the Victorian novel. If we try to classify the Victorian age, it is a period which lasted from 1830 to 1890. This is, as we have done always, a very loose description of the period. This is the same set of years that also get designated as the Age of Tennyson. It's interestingly, this literary period coincides with the rule of Queen Victoria, who reigned perhaps the longest for 63 years, and this period was characterized by peace and prosperity, and there was also sweeping changes which Britain was undergoing in the during the reign of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, but however, the beginning of the Age of Tennyson could be identified as the year of 1830. In 1861, Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. This was a very significant colonial moment. This was followed by the 1857 mutiny and the unrest that followed in the colonial provinces of India. And during this time, we also find the governance shifting from the East India Company to the British Crown. So, this marked a very momentous transition in the colonial system of governance as well. Though Queen Victoria ruled till 1901, generally the Age of Tennyson is said to come to an end by 1887, which also marked the jubilee year of Queen Victoria. During the reign of Queen Victoria, politically England had been undergoing a lot of transition and a lot of changes. So, this was not an age which really celebrated the powers of the monarchy. In fact, monarchy was no longer a popular institution as far as the British people were concerned. But however, due to the increased colonial significance that British Empire began to enjoy across the world, the monarchy began to enjoy a greater symbolic importance. We do not find the British people trying to topple the government or try to depose the monarch's power, but there is a sense that a growing sense that the monarch's power is inherently limited. And since Britain had already undergone many changes in terms of a transition from absolutist monarchy to a more parliamentary form of governance, we do not find any of the following monarchs being under the illusion of ruling as an absolute monarch. So, whatever had happened in France and also the other neighbouring states in terms of revolution only reinforced British ideals about limited monarchy. In the Victorian age, we find Britain undergoing a period of economic expansion and rapid change. It's during this time that the British economy also transitioned itself towards a modern urban economy based on manufacturing, international trade and financial institutions. So, altogether it is appropriate to note that this was the age of industrialization, empire and reform. And if one could identify two major proponents which were triggering all of these developments, one could say that one, it was the progress of democracy, and two, the progress of science. So, whatever that had been happening during this period, it could be clubbed together under either of these seminal events, the progress of democracy and the progress of science. We find that the literature of this period also reflecting all of these sweeping changes which were dominating in the fields of democracy and science. London continues to function as the most important city in England, and we also find that London grows immensely and expansively during this time. The population grows to a greater height from 2 million to 6.5 million during the Victorian age, and we also witness a mushrooming of slums. There is also increased pollution and poverty, and needless to say, exploitation of the working class also followed. Sanitation was a problem that London had been struggling with from the medieval times onwards. We noticed it when we discussed the Black Death and the many troubles that ensued. We find that even in the Victorian period, as the population is increasing, we find London struggling again with issues of sanitation and hygiene. The government and the monarch also tries to implement a lot of new measures, and also there are a lot of hygiene drives which happen in London. This also had another colonial implication. There were a lot of discourses on infection and racial contamination, given that the context was that of an increased contact with other races during this colonial expansion. So, we find a lot of literary writers also responding to this. There was also this general assumption that England was getting more infected and more affected because of their contact with the inferior races who were also colonized under Britain. The transition within Britain towards a more industrialized economy affected its family structure as well. We find more men and women working day and night in the factories, particularly the night shifts and the structure of the working population. It began to affect the family structure as well. And we noticed that the presence of the working women in the factory settings, it was to alter the structure of family in England perhaps forever. This was also the time which witnessed the emergence of trade unionism in order to bring in some kind of a work-life balance in the life of the working class. This period also saw the emergence of various forms of debate in the intellectual circles in London and also in other parts of England. The most important of these were the more moral debates which dominated the period. It was about various discussions on the sexual codes to be followed, the appropriate kind of marriage or the appropriate religious beliefs to be followed, and in general there was a lot of discussion about the kind of morality that should be part of family life in general. We also find the people in England debating more and more about the meaning and the idea of progress. This happened because the idea of progress became more complex than ever. It was not just about an economic advancement, it was also about advancing at the cost of certain others who were actually running the economy. And this was the time when the rights of the working class began to assume a new kind of importance, and also with this increased realization that with colonization and with industrialization, there were a few people who were paying the price for England to advance economically, scientifically and also politically. And this was followed by a number of debates on faith. Later on when we talk about the Victorian poetry, we will also begin to realize that this forms the central concern of most of the Victorian poets. There was also a crisis that followed within the Church of England, and particularly this was accentuated by the conversion of Cardinal John Henry Newman to Catholicism. It is also useful to again recall that England was primarily a Protestant country after the English Reformation. So when we talk about the debates regarding faith, there was also a debate between faith and science and faith and reason. All of a sudden, the theocentric worldview was no longer the only worldview available. It was being heavily contested by the penetrative inventions made from the scientific will and also from the interventions from the rational arguments. This period witnessed unparalleled increase in scientific knowledge. In fact, many of the inventions of this period and many of the new ideas of this period began to challenge and revolutionize the ideas about man, nature and society. For instance, we can find this particularly in the ideas of evolution put forward by Darwin, and we all know that it was to change the basis of understanding of faith, order and the ideas of man forever perhaps. Altogether, all of these turn of events together were leading to the emergence of an analytical and critical habit of mind, and this also led to the development of realism in literature. It would not be wrong to say that in Victorian England we begin to see a more advanced nation. So this could be attributed primarily to the forces of industrialization and also to the growing markets. And we also find England making very smart and wise economic investments by investing in other manufacturing developments using the revenue that they generated from the industrialized economy. We also find England following quite actively the philosophy of free trade or the theory of laissez-faire, and accordingly there is also an importance placed on new technology and continuing industrial inventions. Routledge History of Literature points out that during this phase the country became the workshop of the world. So England becomes a leading colonial empire and also the most important nation in terms of advanced discovery and also the advanced scientific practices. And we also find London transitioning itself towards being the world's banker from the 1870s onwards. This in fact consolidates London's and England's position as a world power from the late 19th century onwards. There were certain particular kind of scientific inventions which were to alter the history of Britain forever. It also changed the way in which future scientific technology could take the nation forward. The most important one was the invention of steam power. So it in fact led to the emergence of fast railways and ships and also to the revolutionizing in the process of printing presses. We also find a number of industrial looms coming up. We overall find even the agriculture of the nation relying heavily on machinery. So the transition becomes almost complete by the end of the 19th century with the postal service and the invention of telephone. We also find there is an increased communication facility available across the length and breadth of the country, and during this time it also forces some of them to believe that we have been living as it were the life of 300 years in 30. So these 30 years in fact mark a significant time of progress in the history of Britain, and it also began to reflect in the ways in which they were conducting their colonial governance, and some of these developments and advancements we know it also spilled over to the colonial provinces. So altogether England was one of the leading powers, and they were also leading the world towards a better economic condition and also towards a better scientific condition. It would not be an exaggeration if we say that this was an age of optimism and positivism. However, one should not lose sight of the fact that this was also an age of paradoxes and uncertainties. Part of these paradoxes and uncertainties were caused by what we now understand as the predominance of Victorian values. there was a contrast between social unrest and the affirmation of what we now understand as the Victorian values, and this in fact in the understanding of this contrast lies the central paradox of the age itself. So before that, it's useful to take a look at this particular term which was coined during the 19th century, the Victorian compromise. If we try to attempt a very simple definition of this compromise implies a double standard between national success and the exploitation of lower class workers at home and of colonies overseas. So this central paradox, in which also took the nation forward, it became the most important impetus which gave rise to a lot of dilemma for the writers and thinkers of this time. While many were quite happy with the colonial strides that the nation was making, many were also quite unhappy and disturbed with the fact that there were a lot of colonies paying the price for this advancement that Britain was making. And also the lower class workers at home and also in the colonies, they remained extremely unhappy, and they did not have any kind of access to the rights that the middle class and the upper middle class population within England had. And this compromise could also be defined as a compromise between philanthropy and tolerance and repression. This could also be evident in the many contrasting and complex laws that England began to pass and the acts that it began to pass from the 19th century onwards. For instance, we do find certain very encouraging events such as the abolition of slavery in 1833 and the tolerance for Catholics in 1829. But alongside these acts, there also existed certain very repressive things such as the punishment of the Tolpuddle martyrs, which was an event in the 1834, and also the conditions of the poor. It was not getting any better. In fact, it was only getting worse. And in 1819, following the Peterloo massacre, there was also a violent suppression of the rights of the unemployed ex-soldiers. But there was also a ray of hope in between, as and when the government began to prohibit child labour, especially in the factories. There was also a Factory Act of 1833 which insisted government inspection and supervision on all the factories. But irrespective of that, we do find that all was not well with the system of governance or with the general temperament of the society. There was a way in which the Victorian values and the Victorian economy and politics were getting into loggerheads with each other. For a more appropriate and a detailed understanding, it's important to understand what the Victorian temper is. It in fact brought together multiple strands of ideology and thinking, and also engaged with this complex compromise that we just now spoke about. So in that sense, there was an ongoing tussle between the conservatives and the liberals. And also there were discussions about social hierarchy and about the classical taste in art versus utilitarianism and collective action. So we do find all of these contrasting and complex elements dominating not just the ethos of the times, but also these things penetrating into the literary works of this period, which is why the Victorian period is known as an age of transition, again signalling the confusions of the modern times and even the postmodern times. Right at the outset, we spoke about the scientific inventions that were challenging the very foundation of faith. So accordingly, when we talk about Victorian temper, it would be impossible not to talk about the divide between the believers and the agnostics, which also framed a central part of this dilemma, the compromise and the complexity of the Victorian period. Another significant social evolution was the emergence of something known as the Victorian prudishness, which also meant that there was a lot of hypocrisy within the society, particularly about sexuality. And we also find that this sort of prudishness led to a certain value system which also later began to dominate some of the colonial provinces of England. And in that sense, there is an increased focus on values such as earnestness, moral responsibility and domestic propriety. But there are times when all of these go overboard, and we find all of these value system getting restricted only in promoting certain aspects of social inequality, social hierarchy and also some gender disparity. And we also find that there is a contrasting drive between the ideas of moral function of art and the drive towards pure aestheticism. When we discuss the Victorian literature, the various aspects and various products of Victorian literature, we shall be looking at all of these elements in detail. And what continued to fascinate and what continued to dominate this period was the fascination for technology and scientific developments. And one of the most important milestones of this period also include the initiation towards the computer age by the inventions of Charles Babbage, followed by Ada Lovelace. Ada Lovelace does have another interesting detail to her life. She was the only legitimate child of Byron, all the other children of Byron's being born out of wedlock. So we also find a systematic shift towards a new scientific temperament and a new scientific age from the age of Victorianism onwards. There were a lot of political events which were underscoring this transition and this new momentous change. The first one was the Reform Bill of 1832, which destroyed the political supremacy of the landed aristocracy. But it was not the end point of the struggle which had only begun between the landed gentry and the working class. Though this Reform Bill of 1832 extended the franchise and gave the right to vote to more people, it excluded the working classes by its insistence on property ownership. In fact, Britain achieves a universal suffrage only by 1918, and the right to vote for all adult women is granted only by 1928. So, in that sense, we notice that whatever happened from the 1830s onwards in Britain was only the beginning of a social change and a political change which was to perhaps reach its culmination only in the 20th century. There was also another movement which dominated this period known as Chartism. This was in fact featured by the working classes demanding parliamentary and social reform. And this movement particularly was concentrated in factory towns such as Manchester, and this peaked during the decade 1838 to 1848. But however, what dampened the spirit of all of these political movements was the industrial depression which happened in the 1840s. This was also known as the period of the Hungry 40s. So, this also led to a very anxious, miserable and critical time in England, particularly for the working class communities. Two more reform bills followed in 1867 and in 1884-85. And this was also a significant move towards the repealing of the Corn Laws of the 1815. In fact, the Corn Laws of the 1815 were not progressive at all. This was a form of agricultural protection offered to the farmers at the expense of the consumer. So, there were ongoing protests against this Corn Law which was instituted in 1815, but however, following the reform bills we find them being repealed, and also there is a slight improvement in the industrial conditions. This socio-political and economic trajectory could be better seen perhaps in the novelistic articulations of this period, and we shall be coming back to this time and again when we progress with the discussion of the literature of the Victorian times. And in terms of power, we also see a transition from oligarchy to crowned republic. It was also much favoured given that England had already transitioned itself from being an absolute monarchist state towards a limited monarchist state. In all of these events, whether social, political, economic or overall historical, we find a movement within Britain towards larger kinds of democracy. And this was also an extension of the political upheavals and revolutions which were happening in and around Europe. In fact, 1848 is designated as the year of revolutions by most of the European nations. And in spite of the many things which were happening across Europe in many different countries, we find Britain holding on to power, and we do not find the British government losing out at any point of time. And there were a lot of unrest happening during this period, such as the working class movement, the Republican groups were coming up, the trade unions were asking for more rights for the working class. There were also a number of dissident expressions from various quarters of the society, and there is more need to foreground and articulate the concerns of the depressed sections. However, we find the British government containing all of these dissident movements as far as possible. But however, it is very important and useful to remember that in literature all such expressions flourished. That was the singular space where all of these expressions and all of these moves of dissidence, moves of anxiety and the moments of this dilemma could be articulated in a better way. And this expression could be found in multiple ways and not just in proper literary articulation. We find in general a breaking down of the feudal distinctions and the spread of popular education and the spread of newspapers. A number of magazines were also getting easily available. Books were becoming cheaper, and there was also a growing reading public, not just in London but in almost all the parts of England. The circulating libraries during this period, they also played a significant role in making sure that the books and reading materials reached everyone across, cutting across a class and gender. And there was a time in England when only London was the centre of all reading, all culture and all political activity. But from this time onwards, with this increased communication and with the increased spread of scientific technology, we find all of nation together participating in this race towards achieving greater heights. Summing up the peculiarities of this war, it is quite notable that during this age we do not find Britain being part of any war. So, in that sense there were no external forces which were causing any kind of catastrophe within England, and England was quite free from any external influence as far as its political and its economic conditions were concerned. We also find England becoming more independent and more concerned about national security, and sense of national consciousness becomes higher than ever. At the same time, internally it was a time when people began to question many of the conventional traits and many of the conventional beliefs. We find a marked interest and growth in religious questions, and also a spirit of inquiry began to dominate all walks of life. This period in general, though it was quite peaceful in terms of politics and history, it could be seen as a period which is characterized by an upheaval in thought. During this time, we find not just the writers and thinkers, but also the scientists, the economists, the politicians, and even the common people being deeply influenced by seriousness of thought and self-discipline of character. This, some of the historians feel that it is an outcome of the Puritan ethos which dominated one of the previous centuries. In a way, as we had been highlighting from the beginning of this course, the sense of continuity and the sense of stability which could be seen in the ideas of literary history, it begins to form a full circle with our discussion of the Victorian period and also the later periods. We begin to notice that there is a connection that we can begin to identify across ages and across literary periods and political periods, and that one era or one event or one movement does not really have a closure in that particular era itself, but it comes back in many different ways in the later kinds of influences as well. As we have talked about multiple things as by way of introduction to the Victorian age, as we begin to sum up, it's perhaps suffice to just quote the words of Macaulay: "The history of England emphatically is the history of progress." So, this is perhaps the way in which the Victorian age is best remembered, and we also will be continuing to look at the various literary outputs of this period. And significantly, unlike most of the other literary ages during the Victorian period, almost all major genres flourished quite well, be it Victorian novel, Victorian poetry, Victorian drama, and a significant Victorian prose as well. So, when we begin our discussion of this period, we also will find it quite difficult to contain everything within the canvas of this lecture. So, again let me wind up this lecture by quoting Henry Hudson, that this period has an astonishing wealth and variety of literature, but only a bare sketch can be attempted. So, in the next few sessions, we will be attempting a bare sketch of the Victorian era, and we hope to be able to do justice to the course as far as possible. That is all we have for today's lecture. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the coming sessions.